Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending my first talk. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. So, my name is Elise Horsball, and I'm an assistant curator in the Military Heraldry and Technology section of the memorial. There will be time for questions at the end. We'll have some roving mics. But I'm just going to get started. So today's talk, Special and Secret, is about Australian aircrew supporting the resistance forces during the Second World War. So for today's objectives, what I'd like to cover is what exactly is Special Operations Executive, who was involved, where did they operate, how were Australian aircrew involved, and a breakdown by each country. So I'll be talking about Poland, so Operation Wildhorn and the Warsaw Airlift, Yugoslavia, Albania, Denmark and Norway. But I'd like to also outline the parameters of the talk. So this talk is obviously going to focus on the more sort of obscure esoteric elements of Australians serving in the Royal Australian Air Force within Royal Air Force units, so oddbods. The missions that I'm going to be speaking about must be Special Operations Executive who are directly assisting local resistance forces, so supply drops, agent transfer or releasing interned partisans. Now, due to the secret nature of these operations, obviously it's very hard to get information on them, and it's only as the archives are digitising the repatriation files that we're able to find them. Now, to find these people, only those who obviously did not return, so they're on the roll of honour, or were captured as POWs or recorded as evading, are known more widely. So unfortunately not included in this talk, I can't fit in France, Germany, Holland or Italy, and there will be a talk in the future on SOE aircrew serving in Southeast Asia. I'd also like to preface this with there's going to be a lot of Eastern European sounding names in this that I'm not going to be able to pronounce correctly. Okay, so what was Special Operations Executive? And from henceforth I'm going to say SOE because it's a lot easier to say. So it was formed on the 22nd of July 1940 by the British government under Winston Churchill. Its role was to conduct espionage and sabotage against Axis powers in enemy-controlled territories by assisting local resistance movements. The headquarters was based on Baker Street in central London, and Churchill famously called it the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Now, it had been amalgamated from three previous secret organisations that you might have heard of. So the first one was Section D, which was Secret Intelligence Service. Section EH, Electra House, which was under the Foreign Office cover. And the War Office MIR, which was the office that developed guerrilla warfare. Now, SOE had several country sections, so it had underneath that subsections. So you could have the Scandinavian section, but under that you could also have the Swedish subsection, or in the Balkan countries, the Baltic subsection. And in larger countries such as France, they would further broken down by regions. Now, it was abolished after the war in 1946. So the reason I've included this slide is because these are objects in the National Collection that are related to SOE. So they're either technology used or designed to be used by SOE operatives. This is probably more of what you think SOE is. So we've got Nancy Wake, the White Mouse. So she was the most famous SOE operative. We've actually got her medal group in the collection. We've got a few different technology that we didn't actually use in SOE operations, but they're actually on display and they're in the annex. But what I'd like to talk about is how do you think these agents were transferred around or taken to their missions, and what technology did they use and how was that taken with them? So what does special duties mean? So originally the SOE could actually not utilise their own Air Force or Navy. They had to rely on the courtesy of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. However, there was a lot of disagreements about this. So with the permission of Winston Churchill, the Royal Air Force Special Duties Service was created. Now, the Special Duties Squadrons were formed for the transport of resistance movement agents and supplies in Axis-controlled territories. It was a secret air service, and squadrons from the Royal Air Force could be assigned or allocated to participate in particular missions or operations. So for example here, these are the actual special duties squadrons that were formed, and they were specifically for the use of the SOE. These down here are the allocated squadrons, so they didn't always do SOE missions, but they could be pulled off to participate. So this is a map of where the different squadrons were based. Now, I will say some of these squadrons moved around a lot during the war, but these are the geographical areas that they covered. So the furthest east that they would ever go was Poland, and they went pretty far into Poland. And then the furthest north they could go was Norway, but they have been known to go as far as Sweden. So they did cover quite a lot of land. So this is basically a breakdown of how I've found these people and how many there are. So this is only for the specified countries, but as you can see, there's not a lot of them, and this is not definitive, so I don't actually have all of the known survivors, obviously, because they're very difficult to track down. I don't have all the known evaders, and I potentially don't have all those that were known to be captured, but I definitely do have those who have all been killed on SOE operations. So to break this down, this one's all of the ones who are on the Roll of Honour and recorded being killed on these operations, so not in training, not on other missions. It has to be an SOE operation that they've died on. This is the ones who've gone down potentially with these people, but they've actually been captured as POWs and they've been interred for the rest of the war. Some of them have actually escaped. And then, as you can see, there's only 2, but these are people who actually evaded and were never captured as POWs, and they've been able to return to the UK. And then these are people that I've tracked down through photos like this. So survivors are found through the casualty repatriation reports, potential medals awarded, that's how I tracked a few of them down, and photographs like the National Collection, and then mentions in newspaper articles. Now, to find those who were killed on the missions, it's not very easy. I had to cross-reference all of the special duties and allocated squadrons with the nominal rolls from the Harrington Museum in the UK and the nominal roll in Agents by Moonlight by Freddie Clark. They were also, it wasn't very clear in that they may have died in Italy, but that could have potentially been on return from an SOE operation. So I also had to explore all my options. So the first country I would like to speak about is the country that started all of this. I actually used to work as a visitor services officer in the galleries, and one day I noticed this medal here on display in Anzac Hall on Courage Column. And I was thinking, well, why does Clive Caldwell have a Polish Cross of Valour? What does this mean? And I actually found out that not only does Clive Caldwell have one, but 5 other Australians earned one. So led me down this rabbit hole. So the first mission that I'd like to speak about is Operation Wildhorn. Now, Operation Wildhorn was also known as Operation Most, which is the Polish word for bridges. So it was known as a series of air bridges to courier information and the Polish resistance agents between the UK and Poland. Now, in this photo is South Australian Flying Officer John Anthony Wells. Now, he was the navigator and the only Australian on the very first Wildhorn mission on Dakota FD 919, and they were from number 267 Squadron. He was also with Ted Harrod, who was the pilot, Bolesław Kopowski, who was the Polish co-pilot, and Noel Wilcock, who was the wireless operator. Now, this journey that they undertook was to go to a place called Matzin village, which was in southeast Poland. Now, this was a 2,000-kilometre return journey, so they needed auxiliary fuel tanks to get there and get back. So they did this in the cover of darkness. They landed in a beetroot field manned by the Polish Home Army, and they successfully managed to unload its cargo of US dollars, I'm not sure how much, but obviously a significant amount, and 2 Polish agents. They also picked up 5 high-ranking Polish and military and government members. Unfortunately, the Germans, they managed to get away and get to Gibraltar, but the Germans discovered that this mission had taken place, and they actually executed the family who owned the field the next day. Now, while no one's not quite heard of Operation Wildhorn 1 or Operation Wildhorn 2, Operation Wildhorn 3 was a very famous mission that actually extracted crucial parts and plans for the V2 rocket, on the 25th of July 1944 and returned them to the UK so scientists could study them. And for this very mission, Wells received the Polish Cross of Valour for special services of a highly secret nature. So I'd like to get into the Warsaw Airlift. So the Warsaw Airlift occurred between August and October 1944. Now, this was when the resistance forces in Warsaw, but all over Poland, staged Operation Tempest, where they were trying to force the Germans out. The Allied forces, so quite a lot of Canadians, South African, New Zealanders, British, they decided that they wanted to help supply the partisans so they could survive the siege. And over 300 Allied airmen were killed during the Warsaw Airlift, and unfortunately it wasn't very successful. So the first person I'd like to talk about is a survivor. Well, he's actually an evader and a survivor. So Flight Lieutenant Alan Hunter Hamay from No. 178 Squadron was born in 1921. He was a chemist apprentice before the war from Red Cliffs in Victoria. Now, Hamay had previously received a Distinguished Flying Medal for an operation in December 1942 where he improvised communications after his wireless was damaged. Now, on 16th of August 1944, Liberator KG 933 was shot down by a German night fighter on return from a supply drop to Warsaw. The fuselage actually crashed into Oskar Schindler's factory in the Vistula River area of Krakow. Now, the other person I unfortunately don't have a photograph of, but the Australian navigator of that crew, Squadron Leader John Philip Liversidge, was killed in this crash. He was 31 years old and a teacher from Castlemaine in Victoria. Now, back to Hamay. He was only 23 at the time, but he successfully parachuted out of the Liberator, and he managed to evade capture by being sheltered by local Polish partisans, and his two other crewmates who also managed to bail out became prisoners of war. Now, Hamay is kind of, if you've ever seen the film Defiance, very similar. He actually joined a Polish partisan group north of Krakow and hid in a forest for 6 months with them. But he decided to actually join them. So he helped bomb railways, supply convoys. He also helped to raid German guard posts. Now, in January 1945, he decided to surrender to the Russians, and he was sent to a British mission, which is basically a big Allied POW camp, and he was returned to Britain via Odessa. He actually fell in love with a fellow resistance fighter. She already had one daughter, and they married and they migrated to Australia after the war, where they started a clothing making factory. Now, in September last year, so September 2019, students from the Jagiellonian University of Krakow actually raised enough funds for and commissioned the Liberator Mural that you can see on the screen here to commemorate the crash of KG 933. So this is near Oskar Schindler's factory, and I understand they also installed a plaque on the wall of his factory to commemorate this crew. So also in the Warsaw Airlift was Flight Sergeant Alexander Bennett, and he was the only Australian on this crew here, and there was also a Canadian. So on the night of 4th of August 1944, Halifax JP 181 was shot down near Letowitz in Poland. Now, it was shot down by Feldwebel Helmut Kunter in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, who had shot down another crew, Halifax JP 162, 30 minutes previously. Now, he was the air bomber of this crew. He was 29 years old, and he was previously working as a salesman in Melbourne before the war. Interestingly, his father was actually from Romania. He was a Jewish Romanian, and his mother was British. The entire crew were killed in this crash. And in 1986, the village actually installed a memorial plaque for the crew, which is this photograph here in the town church. And in 1991, they actually built a memorial out of the propeller of the aircraft on the same site. So it's nice to know that even in these faraway countries, they're not being forgotten. So I'd like to move on to Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia is very complicated, but I'll just sum it up in a bit of a nutshell. In November, so end of November, start of December, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin actually acknowledged Josip Broz Tito, the communist leader of the Yugoslav partisans at the Tehran conference. They had also decided to break with the leader of the nationalist Chetnik party, so Draza Mihailovic, and in this, they openly were saying that they would help supply the Yugoslav partisans. The British SOE had previously launched Operation Hydra in February 1942 to make contact with Tito, but that was unsuccessful. So instead, they started dropping supplies from the air to help them in their fight against the Germans. Now, one of these was Henry Oscar Mason, who was the oldest of 4 brothers. He was born in 1913. His younger brother, Harry Mason, and Kevin Brendan James Mason ended up serving in the Australian Army, and Ronald Victor Mason served in the Air Force as well. They all returned home. Now, he went by the name Oscar. He worked as a radio announcer for 2GB in Sydney, and his show was known as Oscar Mason's Choice. And he also prolifically published short stories, which you can find in all of the newspaper articles of the time in trove. Now, on the 26th of January, so Australia Day 1945, Mason, he was with the crew of Halifax JP 281, and he was the wireless operator. And during a supply run to northern Yugoslavia, the plane crashed on Mount Kamenica in Yugoslavia, which is now modern-day Croatia. The entire crew were killed. And you can see here, this is the area. You can see how rugged it would have been, and it would have been January, so it probably would have been covered in snow. Mason was 31 years old. Now, this is a very interesting story that I actually stumbled across by accident. This is about a gentleman called Flight Lieutenant Desmond Edward James Gardiner. Now, he was the pilot of Dakota KG 472 that took off from Bari, Italy, and was going towards Tito's headquarters at the time in Yugoslavia. Now, Gardiner was 41 years old. He'd actually been in the Air Force since 1927 as a fitter and a turner, but he then went for his pilot's licence. His youngest brother, Kenneth David Gardiner, served in the Australian Army during the Second World War and returned home. Now, the interesting story here is that his passengers included Major Randolph Churchill, who was obviously Winston Churchill's son, and Captain Evelyn Waugh, a very famous novelist at the time, and Air Commodore Guy Lloyd Carter, who had just been helping establish the Balkan Air Force headquarters. Now, their mission was to actually infiltrate Yugoslavia, land their passengers, and get to the headquarters and meet Tito there. But for some reason, the aircraft stalled and actually overshot the runway. So it's in somewhere near Bosanka Dubica, which is on the border of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia, and unfortunately crashed. Now, the whole 4 Air Force crew were killed, along with 11 of the 17 passengers, and Carter died of his injuries only 4 days later. Churchill had very minor injuries. Captain Evelyn Waugh had a few more serious injuries, but they both recovered. Now, this one is a little bit of a sad story. So I want to talk about Flight Sergeant Lewis Walter Calder and Charles Gibson Steele. So on the 17th of October 1944, Lewis Walter Calder from number 148 Squadron was the wireless operator on Halifax JD 319. He was a 23-year-old clerk, and he had a wife and a 1-year-old daughter. Now, they were undertaking an ammunition drop from Brindisi, Italy to Maribor, which is in Slovenia, when they hit trees. The pilot, the navigator, Charles Gibson Steele, who was a 21-year-old pastry cook from Sydney, the bomber and flight engineer were all killed. The air gunner, the rear gunner, the dispatcher and Calder survived the crash. 2 evaded capture, and the rear gunner, along with Calder, managed to escape initially. So Calder had suffered a broken ankle in this crash, and it was serious enough that the partisans who found them decided to take him to hospital, and that's where his lower leg was amputated. Now, in this area, so early January 1945, so they actually sort of hung around in that area for a while because he couldn't walk. The 14th Waffen SS Division, which was made up of the Ukrainian military volunteers, were patrolling the area. But due to multiple avalanches, they weren't able to gain access. However, they unfortunately discovered this partisan hospital at one point. Now, what they did is they took all the healthy patients out, one of them being Calder's crewmate, and then they left the remaining patients inside the hospital and they burnt it down. So Calder was murdered, and his British crewmate became a POW for the rest of the war. So we're going to move on to Albania. So Albania is, again, another complex one, but quite an interesting area that not many people know a lot about. So over 100 British SOE operatives were actually working on the ground in Albania trying to assist the Albanian partisans. Now that was a bit messy because there was an Albanian civil war going on. The SOE operatives and the British government were courting several political leaders, and this is not exhaustive, but I'll list the main ones. So they were courting the communist leader Enver Hoxha, who would eventually become the Prime Minister of Albania, and the royalist Abbas Kupi, who also supported the return of King Zog to Albania. Now, there were several other factions that I won't get into, but the Yugoslav partisans were actually semi-allied with Enver Hoxha, but they also had a falling out. So on a supply run, we have Flight Sergeant Edward Drake Steele Tennant, who was the pilot, Flight Sergeant Dennis Hilton Potter, who was the air bomber, and both were on crew of Halifax BB 444 from number 624 Squadron. Now, I was very lucky to be allowed to use this photo from the number 624 Squadron Association page. Now, this photograph is very rare because it's the only photographs we have of Tennant and Potter. And you can tell which ones they are because they've got the dark blue Royal Australian Air Force tunics versus the lighter Royal Air Force ones. Unfortunately, when it was sent to me, they didn't explain to me which crew members these other ones were. Now, on the 1st of February 1944, the crew were dropping supplies to the Albanian partisans at Drop Zone Sculptor 16. But unfortunately, they crashed on Mount Ostrovice on the way to Potom, Albania. Tennant was 31 and Potter was 21. Now, in recent times, on Remembrance Day 2012, they were posthumously, the entire crew, were awarded the Golden Medal of the Eagle by the Albanian President Bujar Nishani. So another supply drop, this was called Operation Stable 6. This occurred not long after the first, so on the night of the 10th of the 11th of February, Halifax JN 959 crashed near Beljosti in Montenegro. Of this crew, Ian McGugan, the pilot, Bernard Austin Huff, the air bomber, Percy Garfield Mann, the navigator, and Edward George Lee, the wireless operator, were Australian, plus 3 other Royal Air Force crew members were all killed in this crash. However, one crew member, so Flight Sergeant Alfred Henry Elks, who was a Royal Air Force, he actually survived and became a POW. Now, strangely, he's recorded as a POW, however, found records of him being injured a year later on another supply drop to Yugoslavia. So I'm not entirely sure whether he escaped captivity and somehow returned to Britain and then was on operation again. So we're going to move on to the Scandinavian countries now. So Denmark. So Denmark and Norway had both been invaded by the Germans on the 9th of April 1940, despite Denmark declaring neutrality. Now, because of Denmark's landmass, they're not very big, they had a very effective Danish resistance movement with cells all over the country. Now, on the 31st of October 1944, 25 Mosquitoes from 140 Wing RAF, which also contained number 464 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, bombed the Gestapo headquarters housed in the University of Aarhus in Denmark. The mission was to disrupt the Gestapo and destroy their evidence that they were holding on the Danish resistance. This particular mission had actually been requested by the Danish resistance. Now, the same group, so number 464 Squadron, had also previously carried out an attack on the Amiens prison in France in Operation Jericho, where they were trying to bomb the prison to help the French resistance members escape. Unfortunately, there was, again, a lot of collateral damage, so quite a lot of the prisoners were actually killed in the bombing. So I don't know if that would be considered successful. So because of that, they decided to do it again. Now, in this particular prison, you had a very prominent Danish courier called Ruth Philipson. Now, she was from the Jutland resistance. And the resistance leader, Harold Sandbank, was also being interned in Aarhus. Now, they both managed to escape during this bombing and both escaped overland to Sweden. However, the Gestapo archives were destroyed, so it could, really severely limited the Gestapo's efficiency. And only one crew member was forced to bail out. one crew was forced to bail and land, but they all escaped overland. 60 Germans were killed. Unfortunately, 10 Danish civilians and one of the Danish prisoners were killed in the bombing as well. Now, one of the Australians who participated on this was Squadron Leader Ernest Henry Dudley, DFC. Now, he was a section leader during the raid. He's a pretty interesting guy. On the 4th of July, previously he and his navigator had been forced to bail out of the Mosquito after a night intruder attack in France. He fractured his ankle on landing, but he was housed by the French resistance before being returned to the UK. And for his work on all his night intruder missions, he was awarded the Legion d'Honneur medal. Now, he also helped the D-Day landings in Normandy, and he's known for taking out a V-1 Doodlebug rocket in the air. So this is another mission. So I think they thought because the first one was so successful, they were like, let's do it again. So this one is the Shell House raid. So this one happened on the 21st of March 1945. Again, the target was the Gestapo headquarters in Shell House, Copenhagen. It also had archives, and it was also interning a few Danish citizens and Danish resistance movement members. And again, it had been requested specifically by the Danish resistance movement. Now, this one was nowhere near as successful. This is actually a very bad raid. In it, Flying Officer Ronald George Dawson was in Mosquito SZ999 when it crashed into the sea near Nerit Bay and he was killed. Flying Officer John Herbert Palmer in Mosquito RS609 crashed into the sea near Samso Island as well. Now, in 1947, the Danish government was so grateful that they gave the Royal Air Force £4,000 as a gift in memory of their sacrifice and a token of appreciation. However, 4 Mosquitoes and 2 Mustangs were lost on this mission, which 9 were killed in action and 1 was captured. The raid resulted in 18 prisoners being freed. However, one of the Mustangs actually crashed into a nearby school. 125 Danish people were killed, mostly children. 50 Germans were killed. However, 47 of their Danish employees were killed. So really terrible collateral damage. And one of the survivors that we know of because of this photo is Squadron Leader Robert Wilson Iredale, who received a DFC, but not particularly for this mission, but for a few missions he'd done. So back to supply drops in Denmark. So this is Pilot Officer Ross Ferrier Philp, who was the bomb aimer on Sterling LK238 from number 161 Squadron. He had previously worked as a jackaroo before the war. His father was Sir Rosalind Foster Philp, a judge in the Supreme Court of Queensland. Now, Philp was on Operation Table Jam 26, which was dropping weapons for the Danish resistance. Now, for some reason, the Danish missions have some pretty funny names. Operation Sandwich, Table Lamp, Table Jam. There's multitudes of them. But it was all the same thing, dropping supplies or missions. Dropping supplies or munitions. Now, on the 7th of October 1944, his aircraft was set on fire after being chased by some night fighters, and the pilot decided to do a forced crash landing. Unfortunately, Philp, for whatever reason, had moved down to the nose of the plane, and he was killed instantly when it crashed. He was only 21 years old. So it went down in a pretty regional area of Denmark, in northern Denmark, in Vem, and the locals actually buried Philp in their local churchyard. He's still there today. The rest of the crew survived. 1 escaped to Sweden with the assistance of the Danish resistance, 2 became POWs, and 4 evaded capture and managed to return to the UK. So I'm going to move on to Norway. So, as I mentioned before, Norway was invaded on the 9th of April 1940 at the same time as Denmark. Now, Norway was very vital for the German Navy because of their ports, but they could also launch U-boat attacks from their naval ports and attack the Allied shipping nearby. On the 25th of February 1945, the crew of Sterling LJ295 were on Operation Stirrup 2, which was a supply drop to the Norwegian resistance, when it crashed into Holland Ford in Arendal, Norway. Now, it had been damaged by 3 night fighters, and Pilot Officer Eric Sidney Quirk, who was the air gunner, managed to escape. He bailed out of the plane and was hidden by home forces and evaded capture. Rolf William Mann, who was the navigator, and John Henry Caldwell, the air bomber, also managed to bail out successfully, but they were captured as POWs. Unfortunately, the pilot, Russell George Tickner, who was from my hometown Orange, was never found. He went down with the plane, and it's believed he's still in the Holland Ford. John Daglish Stevenson was the wireless operator, and Royal Air Force George Alfred Humphrey, who was the flight engineer, were also killed in this crash. Okay, so this one is not supplying the resistance. So this is at the end of the war, so a slightly different mission, but this is Operation Doomsday. So after the Germans had surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, the Allied occupation of Norway began. So the job of the Royal Air Force was to transport troops to Norway to help occupy and disarm. So they were going to be assisted or assist the some 40,000 members of the Norwegian resistance, the Mylog, who are still in the country, and they were going to be led by the SOE to prevent any sabotage by the German troops. On 10th of May 1945, which was actually Ascension Day, Flying Officer Hugh Joseph Kilday was the air bomber, and Warrant Officer John Leonard Breed was the pilot of Sterling LK-147. Now, it was carrying airborne troops to land in Norway when, due to weather, it accidentally crashed in a ravine near Gardermoen, which is now next to the modern-day Oslo airport. It was one of 3 Sterlings to crash, and one other had a forced landing to crash during this operation due to the poor weather. All 6 crew and 14 soldiers, so from the Border and Leicestershire Regiment, were killed in this crash. So these, obviously I couldn't speak about everyone. I've had to be a little bit selective, and I've tried to find photographs of everyone that I spoke about today. But I just wanted to thank you so much for attending this talk. I feel that these men served and died in countries that they'd probably never heard of. Their missions were political in nature, so they weren't just, bombing and strafing and mining and nickelling. They were assisting partisans, supplying their movements. They helped not change only the course of the war, but I believe they helped change the course of the world we live in today. Some of these missions, not all, were highly secret in nature and were never spoken of. Some of their families would have never known what they were doing and the risks that they took for the medals that they received. This talk aimed to put a face to some of their names and recount the courage of these few men. If you have any questions, we're going to have some roving mics, but I'm happy to talk to anyone after as well.
Thanks, Louise. That was really very interesting. An awful lot I didn't know about at all. My question is, how did they actually choose the aircrew to do this? Was it a volunteer thing? But then, of course, you need somebody with a bit of expertise as well.
I don't think that they volunteered per se, unfortunately, because there are records of quite a few of them doing multiple missions over and over again, particularly the Yugoslav drops and the Polish drops. They've done them over and over again. But obviously I think they are restricted to those squadrons that I listed. And the pilots obviously had to be very talented. I think for Wildhorn, I do think Wells was picked particularly because he was an extremely good navigator. There are, in his service record and even in his personnel file here in the research centre, he is noted for being an exceptionally good navigator, and that particular trip was extremely complicated and very stressful.
Congratulations on a very, very interesting topic.
Thank you.
My question relates to any of those countries. Were any of the any native Defence Force personnel involved in these operations? For example, with the Warsaw Uprising, were there any Polish Defence Force personnel involved actually flying with the Australian crews?
Yes, so the Polish are quite famous for flying with the Royal Air Force, and they even had their own squadron before because they didn't have their own Air Force, Army or Navy because they'd been invaded. So the co-pilot on Operation Wildhorn, Bolesław Kopalski, he was Polish. On a few other crew, actually a few SOE missions, entire crews of Polish aircrew have gone down that I've seen, that every single member is Polish. But it's not as common for there to be possibly one Polish person amongst a bunch of British and Australian Canadians. But yes, they definitely did. Unfortunately for the other countries, it wasn't as common because they had their local resistance fighters and their army was official and separate to us.
Also critical, but I mean, I understand I know about the Warsaw Uprising, but what made it important that there were quite a number of Polish crews involved in that airlift?
I think it was potentially a patriotic thing. Quite a lot of them had actually evacuated to the United Kingdom, and because after they'd been invaded, their entire country was scattered. The same can be said for the army, and so they were quick to join up into Royal Air Force units, and I'd say they probably would have been the first ones to want to do that, because the Warsaw Airlift is a bit complicated politically in that I think the British were very reluctant to get into that, and also the Soviets were barring them from using their airfields. But yeah, I definitely would say, not from actually seeing it on any documentation, but I would say the Polish would have been the first ones to volunteer.
So does that sort of maybe reflect that the SOE had maybe a large component of Polish personnel?
Potentially, yes, but they were predominantly from the allocated squadron, so not special duties that you had the Polish guys in.
Good, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for attending today. And as I said before, you're welcome to come and talk to me afterwards if you'd like.